You finally have a free evening. Nothing urgent, nowhere to be, no real reason to feel anything other than okay. And within about 11 minutes of sitting down, your brain has somehow located three unresolved conversations from last week, a decision you made in 2019 that you could have made differently, and a low-grade anxiety about something that hasn't happened yet and statistically probably won't. You didn't go looking for any of it. It found you. Because the moment the external noise stopped, the internal noise had room. And the worst part isn't the thoughts themselves, it's that you know what's happening. You can see yourself doing it. You can narrate the spiral in real time and still not stop it. That awareness doesn't function as an exit, it just becomes another layer of the thing. If that landed somewhere specific, this is the video, not the version that tells you to breathe more, the real explanation. Because what's happening inside an overthinker who can't relax is not a character flaw, and it's not a simple anxiety problem. It's a nervous system that learned something very specific a long time ago and never got the update that things had changed. Here's what's actually happening neurologically, and it matters to understand this properly before anything else makes sense. Your brain has a structure called the default mode network. It activates specifically when you're not focused on an external task. When you stop engaging with the outside world, this network switches on and begins generating internal content, memories, projections, social simulations, unresolved scenarios. In most people, it runs in the background at a manageable volume. In overthinkers, research consistently shows this network runs louder, more persistently, and with significantly less ability to be quieted by conscious effort. A 2015 study published in the journal Neuroimage found measurable differences in default mode network connectivity in people who self-reported chronic rumination, showing stronger and more sustained activation even during rest periods. The brain wasn't misfiring, it was doing exactly what it was designed to do, it just couldn't find the off-ramp. And here's the part that makes the relaxation problem specific. Rest for most people is a state of reduced cognitive load. For overthinkers, rest removes the one thing that was managing the cognitive load, distraction. The moment the external structure disappears, the backlog floods in, so relaxation doesn't feel like relief, it feels like an ambush. The question worth asking is not just what's happening, but why this particular brain learned to run this way. Because it didn't develop in a vacuum. Psychologist Dr. Naomi Eisenberger's research on threat detection shows that the human brain doesn't meaningfully distinguish between physical threat and social or emotional threat. The same neural alarm systems activate, the same stress hormones release. The body responds to an unresolved conversation or an uncertain relationship with measurable physiological arousal, identical in many ways to the response to physical danger. For people who grew up in environments where uncertainty was emotionally costly, where moods were unpredictable, where the wrong read of a room had real consequences, the brain learned to treat ambiguity as threat. It learned that thinking ahead, running through scenarios, preparing for every possible outcome was the strategy that kept you okay. That was a smart adaptation. In that environment, it was probably correct. The problem is the environment changed and the strategy didn't. The brain is still running threat detection protocols in situations that don't require them, still preparing for outcomes that aren't coming, still treating the unstructured Tuesday evening like something that needs to be survived rather than simply spent. There's a specific pattern here called rumination, and it's distinct from regular worry in ways that matter. Psychologist Susan Nolan Hoeksema spent decades studying the difference between productive reflection, where thinking moves toward resolution, and rumination, where the same thoughts cycle repeatedly in slightly different forms without arriving anywhere. Her research found that rumination doesn't process difficult emotion, it preserves it. The thought loops don't lead to clarity. They maintain the emotional charge of the original experience like a battery that never discharges. And the cruelest feature of rumination is that it feels like problem solving while it's happening. It feels like if you just think about it a little longer, a little more carefully, you'll land on the thing that makes it okay. That feeling is wrong, but it's convincing enough that you keep going. At midnight, at 2 a.m., on the drive to work, in the shower. In the 11 minutes of silence that were supposed to be rest, Jolin Hoeksema's research also found that people who ruminate heavily are significantly more likely to develop depression over time, not because they're predisposed to it, but because the rumination itself amplifies negative emotion rather than metabolizing it. The thinking is the mechanism of harm, not the original event. Here's the piece that almost nobody talks about honestly. Overthinkers who can't relax are often carrying a very specific cognitive belief underneath all of it, one that operates below conscious awareness most of the time. The belief is something like this: if I stop thinking about it, something will go wrong that I could have anticipated. Vigilance is the thing between me and disaster. Relaxing is not safe because relaxing means not watching, and not watching is how things fall apart. That belief is not irrational given where it came from. In some earlier context, it was probably functional. Staying alert meant staying prepared. Prepared meant protected. But the belief calcified into a default operating mode and now runs even when there's nothing to protect against. The brain is standing watch over a building that isn't on fire, that hasn't been on fire in years, that is almost certainly not going to catch fire tonight, and it cannot put down the hose. Clinical psychologist Dr. Guy Winch describes this as the gap between intellectual understanding and emotional updating. The overthinker can know, rationally, that everything is fine. They can recite the evidence for it, and still feel the low hum of unease that tells them they haven't thought about it enough yet, because the emotional brain and the rational brain are running different software. And the emotional brain is older, faster, and significantly louder. There's also something specific happening when overthinkers try to force themselves to stop. Psychologist Daniel Wegner's famous white bear experiment demonstrated this with uncomfortable precision. He instructed participants not to think of a white bear. They managed it briefly. But the moment the suppression lifted, the thought returned with greater intensity than if they'd never tried to suppress it at all. The act of suppression created a monitoring process, a part of the brain constantly checking whether the forbidden thought was present, which ironically kept the thought more active, not less. Every time someone tells an overthinker to just stop worrying, every time an overthinker tells themselves to just let it go, they are neurologically priming that thought to flood back harder. The suppression doesn't work. It builds pressure, and the pressure finds its way out, usually at the worst possible moment, usually in the silence that was supposed to be rest. So what does work? Because this is where a lot of psychology content conveniently goes vague, and that's not useful. What the research actually points toward is not the elimination of the thoughts. That's not the realistic goal, and chasing it adds another layer of frustration onto an already exhausted system. What works is changing the relationship to the thoughts rather than trying to remove them. Specifically, the practice of noticing a thought without treating it as a directive. Seeing the spiral begin and being able to say, with some detachment, there it is, without immediately climbing inside it. This is the core of what clinical psychologists call metacognitive therapy, developed by researcher Adrian Wells, which focuses specifically on the beliefs people hold about their own thinking rather than the content of the thoughts themselves. Wells's clinical trials showed significantly better outcomes for chronic worry and rumination than standard cognitive approaches, precisely because it targets the why of the thinking rather than the what. Not what are you worrying about, but what do you believe will happen if you stop? That question, sit with it. What do you believe will happen if you stop watching? If you put down the vigilance for one evening, if you let the Tuesday night just be a Tuesday night without running it through analysis first, most overthinkers, when they actually follow that question honestly, find that the answer is something old. Something that made sense once. Something that protected them in a specific context that no longer exists. The thought patterns are not the enemy. They're a record, a very detailed, very exhausting record of every time paying close attention kept you okay. The goal isn't to erase that record. The goal is to update it, to let the nervous system slowly learn through repeated experience that the quiet is not a warning, that rests is not risks, that the silence in the room is just silence. That learning takes time. It takes more patience than most people are told to expect, but it starts with understanding exactly what the vigilance was for and recognizing as clearly as you can that the thing it was protecting you from is already behind you. That's not nothing. For a brain that has been running this hard for this long, that's actually most of it.